Alright guys, it's time for a new unit, and that is Unit 7, entitled Westward Expansion, or Happy Trails to You. And yes, we're going to learn about all sorts of trails, but before we do, let's start with Lesson 30, the Age of Jackson. Our teak so that we can identify the age of Jackson, that we can put those events in chronological order as always, that we can summarize arguments over taxation, protective tariffs, and the banking system, all things we've discussed before, that we can explain how the Democratic Party was created in the U.S., one of our two major parties today, and finally that we can explain how Andrew Jackson's election expanded suffrage in the United States. Remember that word suffrage from our reform unit, and we're going to talk about how Jackson's presidency expanded suffrage to more people. So, when we look at President Jackson, he's important, yes. Andrew Jackson was the seventh president from 1829 to 1837. And he was one of a small group of presidents who greatly influenced their times, and this makes him an important president. But the question was he one of the great presidents? And viewed today, his presidency was marked by indifference and racism toward natives and African Americans, something we're going to look at especially in Lesson 32. So let's move ahead. In the election of 1824, there were four Democratic-Republican candidates. Now remember, this is during the era of good feelings, so there really is no opposition party. So all the candidates are coming from the same party, the Democratic-Republicans. Now in this election, Andrew Jackson won the most popular and electoral votes. However, he did not win a majority, and the Constitution requires a majority of electoral votes to win the position of president. So, like we saw in the election of 1800, the election goes to the House of Representatives to break this situation. Now, Henry Clay, you see, he ran and he came in fourth out of the four candidates. While he lost the presidency, he was a very influential congressman, and he used that influence to convince the House of Representatives to choose John Quincy Adams, who was the son of our second president, and not Andrew Jackson, who he considered a person who just wasn't of the right character and the right background for the job, as it says here, the right sort. Oh, by the way, I mentioned that Adams was the first of father-son presidents, and my question is, who are the only other two father and son presidents? And they're a little more recent, so you should know. So now, after Clay helps Adams win the election in the House of Representatives, Adams turns around and makes Clay his Secretary of State. So the question becomes, was there some kind of a backroom deal cut between these two? Well, Jackson supporters sure thought so, and they called this a corrupt bargain. So what they did, the Jackson supporters in Congress used their position and their authority to oppose Adams' plans and largely block him at every turn. Adams had a very ambitious agenda that involved a lot of internal improvements, building roads and canals and expanding business. But Jackson supporters largely blocked him and made his presidency a very frustrating time. However, this conflict between the Democratic Republicans of Jackson and Adams split the party. Adams supporters became the National Republicans, and Jackson supporters founded the modern Democratic Party. So here we have the birth of today's Democratic Party under Andrew Jackson. So these two guys, Adam and Jackson, are going to come up for a rematch the next time in 1828. Now, during this time, democracy is expanding. What we mean by this is during the early 1800s, many states are ending certain requirements that you had to own property or pay taxes in order to vote. So from the time of the RWDs, the rich white dudes that we talked about all the way back in the colonial times in Unit 2, we now have democracy expanding to nearly all white males by 1828. So in that election, Jackson campaigned as a champion of the common people fighting against the wealthy business owners in the North, and he had the support of both farmers in the South and industrial factory workers in the North. So the result is a very high turnout for Jackson. And we call this idea Jacksonian democracy, and that's one of our terms for this unit here. And that's when politicians appeal to the common voters and to majority rule, because the fact is there's a lot more regular folks, a lot more common voters than there are wealthy ones. So let's talk about Old Hickory, which was Jackson's nickname. Who was Andrew Jackson? First of all, their seventh president, he was the first one to not come from a wealthy family. One of the first, in fact, to not come from the northeast towns like northeast states, like Virginia or Massachusetts. He fought and was wounded in the Revolutionary War as a teenager. In fact, the story goes that he was slashed with a sword by a British officer when Jackson refused to polish his boots. He grew up to become a frontier lawyer and a judge. He went to Congress as a U.S. representative and a senator from Tennessee. He married into money, married a wealthy woman, and was able to own a plantation with a number of slaves. He was known for his physical toughness and also for his bad temper and the fact that he fought several duels. In fact, he actually carried around a bullet in his body that had been put there when he was fighting a duel. It didn't kill him, but they were not able to remove the bullet in his chest, and it stayed in there for the rest of his life. All right, so Jackson wins the election, so it's time for his inauguration. Now, before that, though, his wife Rachel dies, and in fact, Jackson blamed the harsh rhetoric and the really the really harsh campaign of Adams supporters against him as a part of the cause of her death from the stress of it all. However, at his inauguration, Jackson invited the regular people who'd elected him to come to his inauguration, and thousands of them showed up to this big reception at the White House. Now, when they got there, the crowd became rowdy. They drank, they took food, they broke china, they stole things from the White House. So the Washington observers who saw this and were used to much more disciplined, much more mannered affairs, were just disgusted by what they saw in this unruly mob, and they were afraid, what is this going to hold for the future of Jackson's presidency? All right, so reforming government. After Jackson becomes president, one of the things that he does is he removes some of Adams' government officials and he replaces them with his own supporters. And this is called the spoils system. And from that we get the term to the victor goes the spoils, meaning that when you win, you get the benefits of winning. So the spoils system is when an election winner gives government jobs to reward their supporters and friends. And we see this all the time today, for example, in ambassadorships, giving those to important donors and supporters. However, Jackson only replaced about 10% of Adams' appointees, so for the most part the government continued working as it had. One of the things that Jackson brought was his kitchen cabinet. This was just a group of his friends who he met with informally, and they discussed politics, and he got advice from them in addition to his official cabinet that had gone through the Senate confirmation process. Jackson and the banks. So, a quick review. The second Bank of the United States was chartered in 1816, which was part of Clay's American system, which we discussed in our last unit. Remember, bank, tariffs, a lot of the same things that Hamilton wanted. So we have a second bank. So in 1832, the bank comes up for recharter. So the bank president, Nicholas Biddle, asks Congress to reissue the charter, and Congress says yes. It's just kind of a routine thing. However, Jackson and his supporters opposed the national bank as unconstitutional. My question to you is which leaders that we've studied would have agreed with him? Remember back to Unit 4, and actually I take it all the way back to Unit 5, excuse me, when there was the argument about the national bank. So go back and think about that. Which leaders would have agreed with Jackson that the bank was unconstitutional? Anyway, he felt that it held way too much power over Congress, and that the bank tended to favor the wealthy over the common people. So the same argument's going on now. So Jackson vetoed the new charter. Boom, there it is. And my question is, which principle of the Constitution gives Jackson the power to issue this veto? Think back to our principles of the Constitution. So the bank becomes a main issue when Jackson's up for re-election in 1832. And the party, the Democrats, Jackson, is that he's fighting for the regular guy, the little guy, the people. And Henry Clay is the candidate again. And this time Jackson wins easily. And he thought that this took this as strong support for his policies against the bank. So Jackson uses his executive power to destroy the national bank, and he does this by transferring the money from the Second National Bank out to state banks, which opponents called them his pet banks, meaning that they were loyal to Jackson. And this forced the national bank to close. Now with this, all these state banks that are now flush with cash, and so lending increases and the economy booms temporarily until overlending of paper money. Again, we've talked about that. If you send out too much paper money, it begins to lose value. And this caused the Panic of 1837, which resulted in an economic depression. So at the end of Jackson's term, we see an economic downturn. So after Jackson, his opponents, such as Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, would form the new party, the Whig Party. And this party supported Northern business. They said that Jackson had become way too powerful and had abused his executive powers. In fact, they started calling him King Andrew. If we look at this little political cartoon from the time that shows Jackson dressed up as a king, and here he's walking all over the Constitution. Constitution's in shreds. Here he's holding a veto paper in his hand. So the idea here is that Jackson's behaving like a king, trampling on the Constitution and using his veto power. So the precedents of Jackson, the idea of a powerful executive branch, a powerful president, and again that appeal to common people, the Jacksonian democracy that's in our elections and is still used today. So let's look at our Lesson 30 thoughts. First of all, how do you think that Jackson's rise from poverty and growing out in the West might have affected his relationship with Congress and other leaders? Number two, do you see any similarities and differences between Jacksonian democracy in 1828 and elections in our time? And finally, number three, why do you think that farmers and common people that supported Jackson distrusted the Bank of the U.S. 40 years after it had been founded? So that concludes Lesson 30, and our next lesson will be on Manifest Destiny. We'll see you then.